Let's look at some of the themes that run consistently through Paul's letters, even the ones whose authorship is disputed. I have 9 of those themes. Number 1, exposition and clear understanding of the good news. The good news of Jesus' life, death, resurrection, ascension, and coming return. Not just as bare historical events, but as means of grace that followers can benefit from by receiving that grace and following. We call that faith. I showed you this chart earlier from C.H. Dodd on the so-called apostolic preaching. You have on the left a number of instances of the apostles preaching, whether it's Peter or Paul, in the book of Acts, and the right 3 columns have occasions in Paul's letters where Paul seems to be doing the same kind of preaching. As this chart demonstrates, as I scroll through it, the key elements of Paul's gospel match the apostolic kerygma, or preaching, in Acts. You see a lot of common themes. Those themes also match the skeletal confession that Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15 he received very early in his Christian life and that he passed on to the Corinthian church. As you look across the rows of this chart and you see common features from left to right, you're seeing themes that cross Acts as well as Paul's letters. In 1 Corinthians, Paul says, "I've passed on to you what I myself received," and he passes on an article of faith that he received from the Jerusalem church. And its key elements are both key elements elsewhere in Paul's letters and in the apostolic preaching in Acts. So it's quite plausible that Luke's version of Peter and Luke's version of Paul sound so much alike, not just because Luke is assimilating them into his narrative, but because they're on the same page confessionally. Paul and Peter and Luke have all learned a common tradition, and they're passing it on as of first importance, to use Paul's own words in 1 Corinthians 15. A second major theme in Paul, and one I want to show you in class: discerning the gospel's unfolding fulfillment of God's biblical promises to Israel. Just as we saw in the letter to the Hebrews, Paul doesn't think Jesus is doing something freakishly new. Jesus is fulfilling God's age-old promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And that fulfillment takes concrete form in Jesus' churches and even in Paul's own life. So Paul sees his unfolding career and the unfolding present age as an ongoing fulfillment of God's will to Israel. Theme number 3, Paul spends a lot of time exploring and presenting the gospel's deeper implications, and those implications run to everything. Every part of creation is touched in one way or another by this good news. After all, Jesus has ascended and reigns over all creation. That takes extravagant form in Paul's letter to the Colossians, but it takes everyday forms. How should we live our lives? Should we go to court when we have a dispute? Again and again, Paul settles ethical questions, cosmic questions, philosophical questions by appealing to the implications of the gospel. I consider my field of Christian theology to be really nothing more than unpacking and presenting the implications of the gospel on everything. And Paul is one of my primary guides because he does it so often and does it so well. He becomes a great mentor. So does John. So does Peter. The writers of the New Testament are coaches for us in training us to see the way Jesus' gospel affects everything. Theme number 4, recognition and avoidance of false gospels and false teachers. Of course, we saw this already as a major concern of the general letters, and Paul shares that concern. His churches are under pressure, and often that pressure is coming from inside, from teachers who are misrepresenting Jesus' traditions, misrepresenting his lordship. And Paul is anxious for his church. He's like a mama bear defending a baby bear that's threatened by an enemy. Theme number 5, Paul wants his churches ready for Christ's coming, for what the New Testament calls his parousia, his appearing, to share the inheritance of his kingdom to those who are ready. And we get ready by cultivating holiness, Christ-likeness, Paul will call it, and cultivating and nurturing and giving and receiving spiritual fruit. A word for this consistent theme that runs across Paul's letters is hope, lives of hope in Christ's coming. Theme number 6 is the missional significance of the church. What I mean by that is the church's importance as not just a product of mission, but as a means of Christ's mission. The mission that has been delegated to Paul gets delegated to all of Paul's churches. I want to show you a super cool chart I found from Jill Marshall, a New Testament scholar, mapping both the churches that receive Paul's letters and the churches that figure into Paul's ministry on Google Earth, to give you a sense of the cosmic character of Paul's vision in a way that two-dimensional maps just don't quite capture. By the way, the green pointers designate cities that receive Paul's letters, his audiences, and the blue ones designate cities that come up in his ministry. Paul sees Christ's church as God's public body, God's new temple, God's building, God's field, Christ's bride, God's people, the kingdom's heirs, not just in one little area, but across the world. And Paul's legacy is a kind of realization of this vision. He has planted churches from across the known Mediterranean world. The fact that so much of the New Testament is letters written across distances to new, planted, tenuous congregations, that's all testimony to the fact that only a missional church could have produced the New Testament. I want to repeat that because it's so important. Only a missional church explains the very shape of the New Testament. And that honors a consistent theme in Paul's letters, that this is why the church exists. This is the unfolding realization of God's eternal purpose, not just to disclose the nature of things through Jesus' death and resurrection, but to flesh that out in real congregations, in real tribes and tongues and nations that spread all the way to the ends of the earth. Only a missional church could have produced the New Testament we have. And that demonstrates the missional character of the church. And that calls for a question. Is your vision of the church missional? Do you think of the role of your local congregation as part of the unfolding mission of Paul's gospel? Theme number 7, the shape of life in those congregations. The spirit-gifted and harmonious shape of Christian collective discipleship in those congregations that are devoted to Christ and devoted to one another out of their devotion to Christ across distances. Geographic distances, as we see, but as we'll see as we look in the letters, social distances, class distances, cultural distances. None of those can interfere with the harmonious life of love. Love is a key theme in Paul's letters that he stresses throughout his career from beginning to end. Theme number 8, that fruitful and faithful life faces challenges, external threats, but especially internal threats. And a consistent theme across Paul's letters is responding faithfully to those challenges, acknowledging them, naming them, and trying to solve them. And by the way, some of Paul's solutions to those challenges are very unpopular today. Nevertheless, they are a consistent theme of his letters and something we need to take seriously. 9th, finally, a consistent theme is the formation of leaders after Paul's example following Christ's example. Imitate me, he says to his leaders and to his congregations. He doesn't seem interested so much in forming a clergy that will do all the important work, so much as forming leaders that will grow the congregations to do the work that all of them share. Those themes all attest to the broad and consistent life and character of this remarkable apostle. Paul is a passionate Jewish vehicle for what he calls the good news of God, a vehicle for that gospel into the Greco-Roman social world and intellectual world. Paul stands as a consistent example of a transformed life. Jesus transformed Paul's purpose, his life, his perspective, and his character. Even while a number of his assumptions are left in place, he doesn't change God's. He doesn't change some of his expectations. Nevertheless, even the ones that are still there have been transformed, really radically transformed, by his understanding of the significance of the coming of the Messiah. And that understanding doesn't just yield intellectual transformation. It yields ethical transformation, character transformation, relational transformation. Paul is a brilliant missionary strategist in a treacherous context, a treacherous multicultural and multi-religious context. Paul is a creative, apocalyptic, messianic rabbi who embodies that Christian apocalyptic perspective, which sees Jesus the Messiah as the fulfillment of what is still an apocalyptic picture waiting for final deliverance. Paul isn't just a brilliant strategist and an accomplished rabbi. He is a tenacious pastor. He is a persistent mentor, raising up people after him to continue his mission after he's gone, and just to continue his mission beyond where he's been able to go. Paul makes an unlikely, world-changing leader, but I think that's part of the secret of his success. His weakness, he says, is his strength, because his weakness is an opportunity for Christ to demonstrate his strength. Paul tells his readers, I carry in my body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may be manifested in you whom I serve. So Paul is on the way of the cross. His ministry, his sufferings, his imprisonment, ultimately his execution, demonstrate that his way is Jesus' way, all the way to Rome, all the way to the end. So why is this life so compelling? Why did Paul change the world? I have a hypothesis, which really just comes down to an observation. Paul's life is coherent. His imagination, his vocation, his lifestyle, his vision, his confession of faith, his mission, and his legacy all cohere. They cohere powerfully. They attract us by their integrity. What you see in Paul's conversion is really the resolution of a disintegrated life, a life that pursued God passionately and yet tragically. These various features of Paul's life and character are synergistic. They work together. They strengthen each other. Actually, that is another theme, that our church's gifts and fruit should do the same. We should be in a position to strengthen one another in Christ's body. Well, in Paul's own life, these elements, all transformed by the kingdom, strengthen each other. God's grace has extended Christ's personal integrity to integrate or reintegrate Paul's formerly disintegrated life. Remember, Paul was zealous for God. He was zealous for his people Israel. He longed as a Pharisee for their renewal and their readiness for Messiah's coming. And yet that zeal led him to persecute the Messiah himself. It led him to a life opposing his own goals. That's a disintegrated life. And God's grace brought powerful integrity and coherence to that life. And the result was world-changing. I'll leave you with this. Paul told his readers, imitate me. And if we imitate him, I'm not saying we're going to become the most influential person in the history of the world. That spot is taken by Jesus, and number 2 is taken arguably by Paul. But we can share in that power, and we can share in the very quiet, slow grace that works transformation around us and to the ends of the earth.